Hello everyone, I'm Bruffy1322 and welcome to another fact-finding video where I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the tuning setups that you can have on your car, and it's basically a continuation of the previous episode of this series. If you haven't watched that, you do need to watch it first because it pretty much gives a primer for everything that I'm about to talk about in this video. So go watch that if you haven't already, but for those who have, we'll get straight into it. Now, before this video starts, I need to give a few disclaimers first, and this is going to be a little bit more of a discussion video than the fact-finding series normally are, I guess you could say. But I need to give a few disclaimers because a lot of what I'm about to talk about is somewhat subjective, and it's going to differ for every single car and every single driver out there. And ultimately, it's not really going to make a difference to the final best lap times that a car is going to be able to achieve. What it may make it do is make it easier for you personally to get closer to that lap time, or just generally give you a better car balance to make you somewhat more consistent. It's not going to ultimately change how good a car can be in comparison to another one. But if you're not already at a certain level, you're not even going to see the benefits of the things that I'm going to talk about in this video. And I touched on this at the end of the previous episode. You can, if you want, use my lap times as a reference. The link to get my testing circuit will be down in the description. You can download that to your game and take your favourite car out around that circuit, and if you can't get, say, within 1 or 2 seconds of the lap times that I get in my testing videos, then these tuning aspects that I'm going to talk about in this video aren't going to help you do that. They're not going to improve your lap times to the point where you can be a couple of seconds per lap quicker. That's not the point of what this video is about. That's not the point of these tuning setups. So if you can't get within those lap times that even I'm setting down, and it's really, when you know the tricks of GTA, it's quite easy to do that. It's quite easy to even beat the lap times that I'm putting there, because I'm not using necessarily all of the tricks because I'm trying to do testing properly in a like-for-like environment. So there are ways to beat my lap times, and like I say, if you're not getting within 1 to 2 seconds per lap of the lap times that I can get, you don't need to be paying any attention to this, because it's not going to help you. Basically, you've got to be at a certain level of driving skill before you can get any sort of improvement from what I'm about to talk about, and ultimately improving your driving by following racing lines and doing all the things that I've mentioned in previous videos in this series. That is going to be much more beneficial than everything that I'm going to talk about here. So and also the aspect of that is that any conclusions that you may necessarily draw from different setups on your car, different tire types, things like that, aren't necessarily going to be the most accurate, because you're not driving at the maximum level that you can really notice these things in the first place. So when you do get to that stage of being able to get the top lap times, that's when these sorts of things are going to come into account. But when you're not driving to the maximum, these things that I'm going to talk about are not going to help you do that, and that's just for improving your skills in all the other ways that I've talked about in previous videos in this series and in the Racing School series as well. So it's hard enough for the top drivers in the game to figure out this sort of stuff, and there's still some debate on it even now. So just don't worry about it too much if you're not quite at that level. But having said all that, I am going to be talking about it to give a bit more information about it, and some people did say on the previous video that they'd be interested in listening to what these differences may be and these advanced tuning setups may be, even though they're not necessarily going to be using them or find them useful anyway. So I figured it would be worth making the video in the first place. So with all that being said, all the disclaimers are over, let's actually get into it. Now, most of these things are pretty much all about center of mass and changing where that is on the car. So if you don't know what the center of mass is, that's basically the average place where the weight of the car is distributed. All cars are different, and it's all in the game code, which is linked in the spreadsheet that I've linked in the description. You can see all of the game code if you're interested in all this kind of stuff. But basically, the weight can be distributed more towards the front of the car. The weight can be distributed more towards the rear of the car. It can be distributed centrally, and everything in between. If cars have more weight distributed to the front, more the center of mass towards the front of the car, it's going to experience more understeer, and weight at the back is going to have a car that's going to experience more oversteer. Understeer being you turn into the corner and it doesn't turn enough, oversteer being it will spin out. For example, it was something like the Dominator. In general, it's best to have the center of mass be as central as possible to the car and as low as possible as well. But different drivers prefer different things, and different cars sometimes react differently to what would be better. So it's all a case of playing about with things and figuring out what's best for that certain situation. Now, let's talk about suspension first of all, because suspension is something that's asked about the most, I would say, in terms of comments on my channel. Now, all suspension does is lower the vehicle, so it doesn't do anything to the actual suspension of the vehicle. It doesn't make it any harder or softer or anything like that. All it does is lower the vehicle, making its center of mass closer to the ground. Now, that effect varies depending on the car. The top supercars, for example, they hardly get any effect at all because they're already very low to the ground, and the suspension differences are very, very tiny. You know, putting the maximum suspension is going to do pretty much nothing in comparison to leaving it stock, and you don't really need to worry about it. But for something like the Dominator, putting the lowest suspension on it can be a big help to make it more stable. Basically what it does is it lowers the center of mass. It means the center of mass is closer to the ground, and that means that it experiences less body roll, and it makes it less prone to oversteer. It makes it more stable in the corners, and ultimately the oversteer that you get with the Dominator doesn't happen quite as often. Like I said, it's not a huge change. It's not going to magically make you be able to drive a Dominator, but it may help in terms of allowing you to be a little bit more consistent over a racing distance, for example. Now, that could be applied to most cars that are high off the ground or experience quite a lot of body roll. For example, muscle cars, they often have soft suspension that allows the body to roll over in a corner. The big trucks, for example, may experience the same sort of thing as well. And lowering the suspension, depending on how much the car actually lowers, because obviously every car is different, and the suspension effects in Los Santos Customs, you can see how much the car is lowered. Sometimes it's not as much as others, but it should help in that respect to make the car a little bit more stable in the corners and make you experience less oversteer. But that does also give you a little bit more understeer as well. So for example, with the top supercars, you may think that a supercar is perfectly well balanced with the stock suspension. If you were to then put a lower suspension on it, it may start to understeer and not be quite as responsive as what it was with the stock suspension. Like I say, it's different for every single car. But this is where we also get into the idea of driver preference as well, because the stock suspension may suit one driver's personal style over the lowest suspension. It may just be that driver prefers to have a bit more body roll. They don't want the Dominator to be as stuck to the ground as it would be with the lowest suspension, because it does induce a little bit more understeer, and maybe they don't want that. Maybe they'd rather control the oversteer. In general, having the lowest suspension will help if your car is prone to oversteer and prone to body roll, but it's not a rule that can be said for every single person or every single car. And that's kind of the difficulty in trying to explain all this. This is why it's impossible for me to, go over every single car and tell you which is the best, because even if I come up with a tuning setup for a specific car that is best for me, that is not necessarily going to be a setup that is best for everybody else. And suspension is the thing that is definitely going to be different for everybody. The best thing to do really is, once you've found a car that you like, start playing around with everything and all the setup on it, and specifically the suspension. It's going to take some time and effort on your part, but also remember that if you're not getting similar lap times to what I've got on my testing track, it's not going to make a difference anyway over and above just improving your racing skills. So like I said, nothing in this video is going to suddenly make you win a race that you otherwise would have lost. They're not that drastic of a change in comparison to what I mentioned in the previous episode of this series. For example, adding turbo and doing all the things I mentioned there. These tuning setups are more of a balance aspect. They're more to make the car feel how you want it to feel, to make you more consistent. They're not going to give you amazing lap times just by changing the suspension on the car, for example. So ultimately it's something that you have to decide for yourself and try different setups and figure out what works best for you. I can't give you that answer, and nobody can. If anybody tells you that they can, they're speaking bullshit, to be honest, because it's different for every single driver, and what works for one person isn't going to work for everybody else either. If you're serious about your racing on GTA, for example, you've got to do some work yourself. You can't just take what I say and roll with it. You know, my advice has always been trying to educate people about racing who may not necessarily know anything about it. When you get to these more advanced levels, there's nothing that I can really say that is going to apply to every single person. You know, it's going to be different for everybody. So it would be reckless of me to suggest something that may not work for everybody. So that's obviously, we've had plenty of disclaimers in this video, I guess you could say, but we'll move on now. So continuing the center of mass idea, we kind of move on to different spoilers. That's suspension all done with, by the way. We're moving on to the idea of different spoilers. Now, all spoilers add the same amount of traction to the car, so in terms of the speed that you can go around corners, you can use any car and you'll be able to achieve the exact same speed going around any kind of corner. Obviously, having a suspension is better than not having a suspension. I've mentioned all this in the previous video. All the more basic stuff, all the stuff that you definitely have to have, is all mentioned in the previous episode of this series. But the difference with spoilers comes in the car balance when applying larger spoilers. Basically, a large spoiler will shift the weight further towards the rear of the car than the smaller spoilers will, and shift the center of the mass backwards, and that induces understeer, or it can serve to get rid of a bit of oversteer as well. So as an example, the largest spoiler on the Massacro will make it slightly more stable in the corners, but it will make it more understeery. Again, it's not going to make a huge difference to the lap time that you'll be able to achieve, but some cars may feel better with that weight shifted towards the back, or conversely, they may feel better with the weight where it is, in which case you would want to use a smaller spoiler, because you know, if the center of mass is perfectly balanced in the center of the car and you want it to be in the center of the car, again the driver preference thing comes in. If you want it to be in the center of the car and it is in the center of the car, putting a large rear spoiler on will move that center of mass backwards, and it will make the car less well balanced for you. You don't want that, so what you want to do is put a smaller spoiler on, which isn't going to change the center of mass. You're getting exactly the same traction benefit from a small spoiler as you are from a large spoiler, but the balance is better for you with the small spoiler. So again, it's all driver preference, and unlike suspension, the best spoiler setup for one person may not be the best for somebody else. It's up to you to experiment, find what's best for you. If you're at the level where it applies, I can't tell you which to use for your driving style, and I can't tell you which to use for every single car in the game. It's just impossible to do that. Now, the next few things I'm only going to quickly touch on, but there's basically the idea that body kits do the same thing as what I've mentioned here. So, you know, for example, adding a front bumper may move the center of mass forward, a rear bumper move the center of mass backwards, and all sorts of other downforce adding effects are theorized as well from side skirts and things like that. In addition, when it comes to tyres, there's theories that different tyre types have different characteristics. All tyres give the same levels of grip, that is definitely proven, but the idea is that some reach their peak levels of grip differently to others, and that provides us with different characteristics of how you want to drive, whether you're driving aggressively or you're more smooth with it. You may want different tyres to use there. Now, this is beyond the normal tyre differences, which only occurs on cars with the tyres can clip handling flag that I mentioned in the previous video, for example off-roads being more smooth over bumps. Now, there's plenty of other things as well that are being theorized in addition to that, you know, such as anti-roll bars actually reducing roll, which could be a good or bad thing depending on the car. For example, if you've got a car that rolls a lot, maybe if it has an anti-roll bar available to it, you can apply that and it won't roll quite as much. Like I say, again, all of these things are going to be tiny differences that are barely imperceptible anyway, but they may help over the course of a racing distance to be a little bit more consistent. And there's plenty of other stuff as well that's being theorized. Now, I would say if you're really interested in this sort of stuff, you should be getting involved in a racing community and taking part in the discussions that take place there. I'll link my racing community, Nonchalant Dominance, that is in the description. You can go there and get involved in these discussions and try to figure this out for yourself if you want. It's not for me to go over every single thing, but like I said, a lot of this stuff has even less of a significant impact on performance than what I've mentioned. For example, the spoilers and the suspension are probably the two easiest things to notice in terms of car balance, even though it's barely perceptible to the majority of people. When you get to a certain level, it's relatively easy to notice that a different spoiler is going to shift the weight differently and give the car a bit of a different balance. But there does come a point where you have to question if some of the things that are being theorized are a placebo or not, especially when you get conflicting reports as well. And this is something that you've got to be very, very careful about, and this is something that when it comes to vehicle testing and trying to make sure that the stuff that I give over in these videos is factual information, it's very difficult to prove it one way or another. For example, the different tyre types having different characteristics, it's very difficult to prove that one way or another. You can have people test it, but some people will say there's absolutely no difference whatsoever, and especially when you have some of the very, very highest level people. I'm not going to name names, but some of the people that I consider to be the best drivers in the entire game, saying that there's absolutely no difference when they've done the testing in terms of the tyre types, but then you get other people saying that there are differences, but the lap times don't really reflect that. There's no difference in the lap times, it's more of a difference in feel. You have to look at something like Occam's razor, which suggests that the simplest option is often the correct one. In particular, there's actually no difference whatsoever, and anything that anybody finds is just perceived in their own mind. Now, I'm certainly probably more on the side of thinking that personally about most things in this game. I'm always skeptical of stuff like this because in the end there's no definitive proof beyond what people say, and when people say different things, everybody can't be right. And often in these cases, when you have a lot of people with different conflicting reports and different, some people will say that tuner tyres are better on a certain situation, and some people will say that high-end tyres are better in a certain situation, and those reports don't marry up with each other. The usual case there is that it's all in people's minds and really there's no difference, and I think that is the most likely scenario in that case, that nobody is right. When people say different things, everybody can't be right, and the most likely scenario is that nobody's right. But having said all of that, I do, with these videos, I'm trying to give both sides of it. I'm trying to open people's minds to make sure that people don't blindly believe one way or another, and they can look at things themselves. And like I said, it's all to do with what feels better for you personally, so don't necessarily take what everybody says in every single thing that you read as fact. Certainly make your own decisions and be skeptical about every single thing. That's the best way to be. But having said all of that, I will link a document and a forum thread down below where these things do get discussed and these things get documented and all that kind of stuff. And if you are interested, you can get involved in that, and it's more for the interest of figuring it out more than it is whether it's going to have an effect on your racing performance. All of the things here are going to have such a tiny effect on your personal racing performance that I don't necessarily feel the need to go into every single one of them any further. I've kind of covered the main two, and I've tried to explain a little bit about the extra features that some people are theorizing about. But ultimately, like I said, and I keep saying, it's not going to make you a better driver just by changing these features. They are tiny little things for car balance for only the top drivers in the game to even worry about, and even then some of the stuff may just be imagined in their own heads. And that's not to say that I don't necessarily believe people, but the placebo effect can be quite a powerful thing, and it's very difficult to prove these things one way or another. But ultimately, if you're just interested in this sort of thing and figuring these things out and want to try to understand the game a bit better, not from a racing perspective, not just to get better at racing or have a quicker car, which isn't going to be the case if you pursue these sort of things, but if you're just genuinely interested in the whole idea of this sort of thing. Like I said, the document and the forum thread, they're linked below in the description. You can feel free to get involved in that sort of stuff. But ultimately, with all things said and done, you just need to do what's best for you. Whatever makes you personally drive better, even if it is a placebo, if it makes you go quicker because you think it does, it's worth it. If you put suspension on a car of a certain level and you put a certain spoiler on and you put side skirts on and you put front bumper on but you leave a rear bumper off, and you put a specific type of tuner tire on, and that gives you the best lap times, then that's fine. Even if some of the stuff doesn't have any effect whatsoever, if you're thinking that it does and it makes you drive more consistently and more better because you feel like you've got the best stuff on, then it's worth it. And whether it makes a difference or not doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter at all. The only important thing is that you don't tell everybody else that it does too, because on the one hand, like I say, it may very well just be a placebo, and on the other hand, it's not necessarily the case that every driver has the same preferences for a car setup that you do. So it's all well and good having your own personal preferences for car setups, but don't necessarily assume that that's going to be the best for everybody, and don't necessarily assume that the things that you're thinking are correct, because it's very possible that it could be a placebo, and we've seen that a lot in the past as well. So it's a very difficult subject to talk about. It's a very difficult subject to explain and get out there. Hopefully I've done as well as I possibly can. Like I say, it's a tricky one because it's not something where, you know, for example, knowing that the turbo and the things that increase acceleration in Los Santos Customs, knowing that they also increase top speed, is easy to prove, because I can do a test with the stock vehicle and I can do a test with an upgraded vehicle, and the upgraded vehicle will have a higher top speed. That's something that is, you know, set in stone. It's very, very easy to understand. But for stuff like this, where it's very, very small differences, very tiny little aspects that ultimately may not help the vast majority of people who are even watching this video, it's very difficult for me to go totally, completely 100% in depth about it and give a full opinion on and try to, and ultimately tell people something is something when it may not necessarily be the case, and it may not necessarily be that that thing is better for everybody as well. So, you know, like I say, if you believe that a certain setup works for you, then go for it. That's perfect. And I can't tell you what is going to be best for you. You need to actually go out there. You need to take your car to Los Santos Customs, put various different setups on it, and find what works for you. Sometimes you may not notice a difference at all. Sometimes you may get a bit of help with, for example, the Dominator. I've felt that putting the low suspension on the Dominator does help, but it may not necessarily be the case for you because you may not prefer the Dominator to drive like that. So you've got to do a bit of work yourself. You know, I can't give you all the answers, but like I've said so many times throughout this video, if you're not able to get close to the lap times that I'm setting in my testing videos, this sort of stuff isn't going to magically make you do that, so you don't have to worry about it for the most part. When you get to the sort of level that you're racing with the top guys in the game, that's when you can maybe think about this sort of stuff. But for now, just put anything that you want on your car and just work on improving your racing performances, work on improving your racecraft, on improving your racing lines, getting better at figuring out the curb boosts and the lines for each individual track, using the cars that suit you. And that's something that, you know, I'll quickly finish on this, that the difference in car performance is much more important than the difference that you're going to experience from these little tuning aspects. And in particular, using a car that is right for you is going to have a much more significant effect than just being able to, you know, for example, putting a big rear wing on a Masacro isn't going to suddenly make you like the Masacro if you prefer the Jester as a overall way to drive a car. So, you know, like I say, there's so much to do with this, and some of it may be true, some of it may not be true. You've got to be skeptical about every single thing that you read, and ultimately you've got to do the work for yourself and try these things out for yourself. If you notice a difference and it makes you drive better, then great. If not, then nothing lost. Ultimately, it's all just about you, your personal preference, and you getting the setup that works for you, whether it's good for somebody else or not. So that's pretty much it. This has been a long rambling discussion video, but I did want to cover this a little bit, and I wanted to go somewhat in depth about it, but not try to give people the wrong impression that, you know, you can magically change your suspension and everything will be okay on every single car. But hopefully it has been interesting, and it has been a bit of more of an insight into the more finer aspects of car performance on GTA and the sort of things that people are looking into. Now, like I say, a lot of information down in the description, and most importantly, watch the previous video in this series if you want really the basics and the things that you absolutely do need when it comes to racing in this game. So thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you next time.